course, Nelson Mandela is the icon of African democracy. But while he was still in jail back in 1980, another black ruler brought an end to white minority rule in his country, and he was hailed around the world as a freedom fighter then. That country was neighboring Zimbabwe, and that man was Robert Mugabe. It's hard to imagine today as he embodies one-man, iron-fist rule. Nearly 4 years ago, I came face to face with Mugabe and I asked him about his place in history. Can I ask you a question about Nelson Mandela?
He's a great man, that one, yes.
Nelson Mandela has got so much of the attention for being the great liberator of Africa.
Yes.
You did it earlier. Do you sometimes wish that you had got as much attention?
President Mandela is President Mandela, and Robert Mugabe is Robert Mugabe. Okay. Look at him in his own circumstances, and that's it. If you damn him, well and good. But I know my people have great praise for me. I know African people think very highly of me. And that satisfies me.
It does?
Yes.
Even though you lost these elections?
Which elections?
The last ones.
No, we didn't lose the elections at all.
That's because they haven't been free and fair, and Mugabe has won, in fact, every time. And at 89, he's standing for election once again next month. And once again, there's a crackdown on the opposition and on human rights defenders, like my next guest, Beatrice Mtetwa. Here she is in action in a recent documentary about her struggle for the rule of law.
24, take one.
Unlike a lot of other dictators, Robert Mugabe doesn't just go out and do what he wants. He first goes to Parliament and passes a law and says it is now legal to punch somebody in the nose. And if you say, hey, you can't do that, he says that is the law.
President Obama himself has been extolling the rule of law on this Africa trip and, of course, of democracy. Before he got to Africa, I spoke to Beatrice about whether she thinks the rule of law is possible for Zimbabwe to achieve anytime soon. Beatrice Mtetwa, thank you so much for joining me from London.
Thank you.
Let me start out by asking you, what you just said on that clip of the documentary was so powerful. It almost encapsulates exactly what is happening in Zimbabwe today. And you are a lawyer trying to use the Constitution to defend political figures, to defend human rights figures. How can you do that when the law appears to be arbitrary?
Well, we try to do what we can, really, within the confines of the environment we operate in, and we get lucky sometimes and things go our way. Sometimes we don't get so lucky. So unless you try, you never really know what you can do with the law. Describe the abuses that your clients face. Well, I've had a client who's been abducted, and for 3 weeks she was being tortured. Basically a whole lot of human rights defenders who have been not just physically harassed, but also psychologically tormented.
So tell me in a nutshell, what is the charge against you? What is the so-called law that you were brought in under?
The allegation is that I obstructed the police from doing their work when I was called to a client's home, which was being ransacked, and I asked for a search warrant, and they didn't give it to me. And they said that I shouted and I screamed at them and obstructed them from carrying out their work.
And what could you face for shouting and screaming? What is the maximum sentence you could face?
It's 2 years. I could be in jail for 2 years if I'm convicted.
So just to be clear, that is 2 years for shouting and screaming at the police, saying that you wanted to have a search warrant.
Well, that is what it would mean. I mean, how you can stop somebody from doing a search by shouting, just the mind boggles, literally.
You've had quite a lot of aggression and violence directed towards you. What do you think your future is in Zimbabwe?
Well, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. If I get convicted, I get convicted and I serve my time and see what happens thereafter. What can I do other than that? I'm hoping to continue practicing, and basically because I don't believe that I should be prosecuted for doing my job.
Well, of course, we've been covering Zimbabwe and looking at the political situation for many, many years now. There is another presidential election coming up at the end of July. Do you feel that there is stepped up crackdown against opposition, against human rights activists, against journalists. Do you feel that that's happening in Zimbabwe right now?
Certainly in the last 9 months, we've seen a lot of civil society activists being arrested. A number of them are being prosecuted currently, and I'm defending some of them. I also believe that my arrest is part of that crackdown because they want as few human rights lawyers to be out there during the election period as they can manage to stop. So clearly, there has been a crackdown, and it is directly connected to the elections.
Well, let me play you a clip of an interview that I conducted with Robert Mugabe about 3 years ago. It was just after an election that eventually he triumphed in, as you can imagine. And I asked him about staying in power. Listen to this. Why is it so difficult to leave power in a reasonable way when you're up? Instead of waiting until it gets to this stage.
Not when you don't leave power when imperialists dictate that you leave.
No imperialists. You were the president.
No, there is regime change. Haven't you heard of a regime change program by Britain and the United States, which is aimed at getting not just Robert Mugabe out of power, but Robert Mugabe and his party out of power? And that naturally means we dig in, remain in our trenches.
Beatrice, how do you read that? That was 3 years ago. Remain in our trenches, dig in. Do you think there's any chance that this ruling party will be voted out?
You know, my view is really that whether they are in or out, they should simply just respect the rule of law. Whoever is in power must respect the rule of law. And there would be no need for people like me if whoever is in power respects the rule of law. I'm not part of any regime change agenda. My job is to be a lawyer, and I shouldn't be harassed for doing my work.
So let's ask about the constitutional changes that recently were passed, that a president cannot be in power for longer than 2 5-year terms. But apparently this is not retroactive to the current president, which is Robert Mugabe, and that he can actually even stand again for election and may be in power for another 10 years if he wins, up to the age of 99 if he survives. Why on earth and how on earth was that able to be passed?
Well, because the other political parties agreed to it, and the people agreed to that being in the Constitution, and therefore it's become the law. But I just find that the Constitution is completely overrated because it can be changed any time, as we've seen with the previous Constitution. And really, it's a piece of paper that we are still yet to see whether its provisions will be carried through. It has some good clauses, it has some bad clauses, but the proof of the pudding is really in the eating. How will it be interpreted going forward? Will it give people rights? Will somebody change it as and when it doesn't suit them? We don't know. The jury is still out on that.
And then, of course, there is a problem with the opposition. Morgan Tsvangirai has had all sorts of negative publicity recently, from the price of his house to the upscale nature of some of his vacations. I mean, there's all sorts of sort of opposition to him as well. People seem to be disappointed in him. What's going on there? Do you agree that the opposition is not in a strong position?
Well, I mean, all these guys are politicians, and we know that generally with some of these guys, when you get in there, the power is more important than serving the people. And so we don't know how the MDC would perform if it was in full control of the entire country. The jury is still out again on how they would perform. Yes, certainly there has been a lot of negative publicity against the MDC's leadership, and obviously that affects how the people will view that party going forward.
Beatrice Mtetwa, thank you so much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.